John Matthews was once a name whispered with admiration in the halls of prestigious universities and cutting-edge research facilities. A prodigy in theoretical physics, John had revolutionized the field with his pioneering work on quantum mechanics and temporal anomalies. But now, as he sat in the stark, sterile confines of a psychiatric hospital, his reputation was shattered, his achievements mocked, and his sanity questioned. The journey that led John to this point began in a dimly lit basement laboratory filled with the hum of advanced machinery and the flicker of monitors displaying complex equations. For years, he had poured his heart and soul into the pursuit of a dream that most deemed impossible: time travel. Endless nights of solitary research, meticulous calculations, and countless failed experiments had finally culminated in this moment. John stood before his creation, a gleaming apparatus of metal and wires, its core pulsating with a strange, blue light. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the machine, securing the door behind him. His hands trembled as he set the date, 30 years into the future. With a final, resolute push of a button, the machine roared to life. A brilliant flash of light engulfed him, and for a fleeting moment, John felt as if he was being torn apart at the molecular level. Then, as quickly as it began, the sensation ended, and he found himself standing in a world that was both familiar and alien. The future was a place of breathtaking technological marvels and stark societal divides. Towering skyscrapers pierced the sky, their surfaces covered in screens displaying advertisements and news. Vehicles zipped through the air, leaving trails of light in their wake. People moved about in clothing embedded with advanced technology, their every action monitored by unseen eyes. John's initial awe soon gave way to horror as he delved deeper into this future society. Despite the advancements, humanity was fractured. The wealthy elite lived in luxurious floating cities, insulated from the troubles of the world below, while the poor struggled to survive in overcrowded, polluted slums. Crime was rampant, and the government maintained order through an iron-fisted regime of surveillance and oppression. For a month, John navigated this brave new world, documenting everything he saw. He uncovered secrets that chilled him to the bone. The planet was on the brink of ecological collapse, wars had reshaped nations, and natural disasters had become more frequent and devastating. John realized that his journey wasn't just a scientific milestone, it was a warning. The future he had witnessed was a dark and dangerous place, and he was determined to prevent it from coming to pass. Returning to his own time was even more disorienting than the journey forward. He stumbled out of the machine, his mind reeling from the overload of information. Desperate to share his findings, John reached out to his colleagues, eager to prevent the grim future he had seen. But instead of being hailed as a visionary, he was met with skepticism and scorn. "John, you've lost it," said Dr. Karen Blake, an old friend and fellow physicist, her voice heavy with concern. "Time travel? You need help." Despite his frantic attempts to prove the validity of his claims, no one believed him. His detailed notes, his vivid descriptions of future events, none of it was enough. His behavior, increasingly erratic and desperate, only served to convince others of his insanity. It wasn't long before he was reported and forcibly admitted to the psychiatric hospital. Days turned into weeks as John languished in the sterile environment, his mind teetering on the edge of despair. The doctors treated him with a mix of pity and caution, prescribing medications that dulled his senses and made it harder to think clearly. Cut off from the outside world, John was labeled a madman. Yet even in his isolation, John knew he couldn't give up. The future he had seen was too real, too imminent to ignore. He began to plan, to think of ways to prove his sanity and the truth of his journey. He had to find a way to make the world listen before it was too late. Every night, lying on the thin, uncomfortable mattress of his hospital bed, John replayed the events of his journey. The faces of the desperate and the oppressed haunted his dreams, their voices a constant reminder of his mission. He remembered the children scavenging in the ruins of once great cities, the skies choked with the smoke of endless industry, and the eerie silence of the abandoned countryside. One evening, as the sun set and the long shadows crept across his room, John had a breakthrough. He realized that the key to convincing others lay not in his words, but in his actions. He needed to demonstrate his knowledge of the future in ways that were undeniable and impactful. With renewed determination, he began to devise a plan. John started small, predicting minor events that he had seen in the future. He accurately forecasted the outcome of a local election, the stock market's fluctuations, and even the winner of a popular sports tournament. At first, these predictions were dismissed as lucky guesses, but as they continued to come true, people began to take notice. The hospital staff, who had once treated him with condescension and detachment, started to see him in a new light. Some of the nurses and orderlies began to believe that perhaps John was more than just a delusional patient. Dr. Blake, however, remained skeptical, convinced that John was manipulating the truth somehow. As John's reputation slowly began to shift, he used his growing influence to secure his release from the hospital. It took months of legal battles and psychological evaluations, but eventually, the court ruled in his favor. John walked out of the institution, a free man, but with a heavy burden on his shoulders. He knew that his real work was only just beginning. Back in the world outside, John wasted no time. He reached out to former colleagues, journalists, and anyone who would listen. He shared his visions of the future, backed by his impeccable record of predictions. Slowly but surely, he began to gather a following. People were drawn to his charisma and his apparent ability to see beyond the veil of time. John's growing influence brought him into contact with powerful individuals, politicians, business leaders, and media moguls. He leveraged these connections to gain a platform, appearing on talk shows and news programs to spread his message. He warned of the impending ecological disaster, the societal collapse, and the wars that would reshape the world. And through it all, he maintained an air of calm authority, a man who had seen the future and was determined to change it. But as John's influence grew, so did his sense of power. He began to realize that his knowledge of the future gave him a unique advantage over everyone else. He could manipulate events to his favor, shape outcomes to suit his desires. The temptation to use this power for personal gain became increasingly difficult to resist. In the beginning, his actions were small and seemingly innocuous. He made investments that paid off handsomely, thanks to his insider knowledge. He advised political figures, steering them in directions that benefited him. But as his ambitions grew, so did the scale of his manipulations. John began to engineer larger, more significant events, all while maintaining the facade of a benevolent visionary. Behind closed doors, John orchestrated the rise and fall of corporations, the careers of politicians, and even the outcomes of international conflicts. He justified his actions by convincing himself that he was guiding humanity towards a better future, but deep down, he knew he was driven by a hunger for power and control. As John stood at the pinnacle of his influence, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From a broken man in a psychiatric hospital to a master of the future, he had achieved what few could even dream of. But the cost of his ascent was steep, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to unravel. The more he manipulated, the more he attracted the attention of those who saw through his charade. A growing number of people began to question his motives, to dig deeper into his past and his claims. Whispers of dissent turned into vocal opposition, and a movement began to form, a group determined to expose John for what he truly was. Unbeknownst to John, among his critics was someone he had once trusted deeply. Dr. Karen Blake, who had never fully believed his claims, had been quietly investigating his rise to power. She had gathered evidence, spoken to those who had suffered under John's machinations, and was preparing to reveal the truth to the world. John, blinded by his own hubris, failed to see the storm brewing on the horizon. He continued to push forward with his plans, convinced that he was untouchable. But as the walls of his empire began to crumble, he would soon realize that the future he had fought so hard to change was slipping out of his grasp. John Matthews had managed to claw his way out of the psychiatric hospital, using his knowledge of the future to earn his freedom. Now, as he stood in his modest apartment, surrounded by the tools of his trade, computers, notes, and a few pieces of advanced technology, he felt a mixture of triumph and trepidation. He knew that his journey had only just begun, and that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. In the weeks following his release, John focused on establishing his credibility. He carefully timed his predictions to coincide with major events: an unexpected election result, a sudden market crash, the discovery of a new scientific breakthrough. Each prediction added to his growing reputation, drawing more attention to his claims. John's presence on television and social media became a regular occurrence. He spoke with a calm authority, describing a future that seemed both fantastical and disturbingly plausible. People were captivated by his words, and a growing number began to believe in his vision. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a charlatan, but no one could deny the accuracy of his predictions. Despite his apparent success, John was acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. He had seen firsthand the brutality of the future government, and he knew that his actions would not go unnoticed. As he continued to manipulate events from behind the scenes, he began to notice subtle signs that he was being watched. It started with small things: a shadowy figure lingering outside his apartment, a strange car parked down the street, a feeling of being followed. John dismissed these incidents at first, chalking them up to paranoia. But as they became more frequent, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was closing in on him. One evening, as John was reviewing his notes on future events, his phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unlisted, and the message was short but chilling: "We know what you're doing. Stop now, or face the consequences." The message sent a shiver down John's spine. He knew that whoever had sent it was serious, and that he needed to be careful. He doubled his efforts to stay under the radar, avoiding public places and limiting his contact with the outside world. But despite his precautions, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. One night, as John was walking home from a meeting with a potential ally, he felt a presence behind him. He quickened his pace, but the footsteps followed, growing louder with each step. Panic set in, and he broke into a run, darting through the dimly lit streets in a desperate attempt to lose his pursuer. Just as he thought he had escaped, a hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. John found himself face to face with a tall, muscular man dressed in dark clothing. The man's expression was cold and unyielding, and his grip on John's shoulder was like a vice. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You've been making waves, and there are people who don't like that." John's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man tightened his grip, his eyes boring into John's. "I'm someone who knows the truth about you. And I'm here to warn you, stop meddling with the future, or there will be consequences." Before John could respond, the man released him and disappeared into the night, leaving John shaken and more determined than ever. He knew that he couldn't back down, not now. The future depended on his actions, and he was willing to face any threat to see his mission through. In the days that followed, John became increasingly paranoid. He installed security cameras around his apartment, changed his phone number, and even considered moving to a new city. But no matter what he did, the feeling of being watched persisted. Then, one afternoon, as he was sifting through his email, he received a message from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "I believe you." Intrigued, John opened the email and read the contents. "John, my name is Emily. I've been following your predictions and I believe you. I know what it's like to be dismissed and ridiculed for telling the truth. I want to help you. Please meet me at the park tomorrow at noon. I'll be wearing a red scarf." John's first instinct was to ignore the message. It could be a trap, another attempt to silence him. But something about the email felt genuine. After some deliberation, he decided to take the risk. The next day, John arrived at the park a few minutes early, scanning the area for any signs of danger. As promised, a woman with a red scarf was sitting on a bench near the fountain. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Are you Emily?" John asked, sitting down beside her. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes. Thank you for coming. I know this is dangerous, but I need you to know that you're not alone. There are others who believe in your vision and want to help you." John felt a surge of relief. "Why are you doing this? What's your story?" Emily took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the fountain's cascading water. "I'm a journalist. I've spent years investigating government corruption and corporate malfeasance. When I came across your predictions, I knew there was something more to your story. I've seen enough to recognize the truth when I see it. And I want to help you expose it." As they talked, John realized that Emily could be a valuable ally. Her skills, connections, and determination were exactly what he needed to push his mission forward. Together, they began to formulate a plan to gather more evidence, recruit additional supporters, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation with those who sought to stop them. With Emily's help, John's efforts began to gain traction. They worked tirelessly to expose the dark secrets of the future, releasing information that sent shockwaves through society. Their revelations sparked debates, protests, and a growing movement of people demanding change. But the opposition was fierce. Powerful forces moved against them, attempting to discredit their work and silence their voices. John and Emily found themselves in a dangerous game of cat and mouse, constantly on the move, always looking over their shoulders. One evening, as they were preparing to release a particularly damning report, their hideout was raided. John and Emily barely escaped, fleeing into the night with only the clothes on their backs and the knowledge in their heads. The raid marked a turning point, forcing them to confront the reality that their lives were in constant danger. Despite the risks, John and Emily pressed on, their resolve strengthened by the adversity they faced. They knew that the stakes were higher than ever, and that the future of humanity depended on their success. With each passing day, the lines between friend and foe blurred, and the true extent of the conspiracy against them began to reveal itself. As the shadows closed in, John and Emily braced themselves for the battles ahead. They were determined to uncover the truth, expose the corruption, and change the course of history. And in the face of overwhelming odds, they would stop at nothing to achieve their goal. John Matthews and Emily Parker had become an inseparable team, their bond forged in the fires of adversity. As they continued to expose the truths about the future and gather more supporters, their influence grew. But with this newfound power came increased scrutiny and danger. John's predictions had always been strikingly accurate, but now, with Emily's investigative prowess, they had the means to broadcast their findings on a much larger scale. The internet became their primary battleground, where they released videos, articles, and leaked documents that painted a vivid picture of the dystopian future John had witnessed. Their revelations sparked outrage and fascination. People began to rally behind them, seeing John not just as a prophet but as a harbinger of change. Protests erupted worldwide, demanding action against the corrupt systems John had described. The media, initially skeptical, could no longer ignore the movement. John and Emily found themselves in the spotlight, their every move watched by millions. But with fame came enemies. Powerful individuals and organizations, threatened by the duo's revelations, launched smear campaigns and attempted to discredit them. John was accused of being a fraud, a madman, and even a terrorist. Yet, each attempt to silence him only seemed to strengthen his resolve and expand his following. John's growing influence brought him into contact with powerful allies. Politicians seeking to align themselves with his cause, tech moguls interested in his knowledge of future advancements, and even military officials wary of the looming threats he had predicted. These alliances provided John with resources and protection, but they also complicated his mission. Among these allies was Senator Richard Thompson, a seasoned politician with a reputation for integrity. Thompson believed in John's vision and saw an opportunity to enact meaningful change. He offered John a platform to speak directly to the public, to address the concerns and fears that had been stirred by his predictions. "John, the world is listening," Thompson said during a private meeting in his office. "We have a chance to make a real difference, but we need to be careful. The forces against us are formidable, and they won't hesitate to use every means at their disposal to stop us." John nodded, aware of the risks but buoyed by the senator's support. "I understand, Senator. But we can't let fear dictate our actions. The future I've seen is coming, and if we don't act now, it'll be too late." With Thompson's backing, John began to address larger audiences, his message resonating with people from all walks of life. He spoke of unity, resilience, and the power of collective action. His words inspired hope, but they also carried a warning, a reminder of the dark future that awaited if humanity failed to change its course. As John's influence grew, so did the temptation to use his knowledge for personal gain. It started innocently enough, an investment in a tech startup he knew would succeed, a subtle nudge to a politician about an upcoming scandal. Each action seemed justified, a means to an end. But the line between helping humanity and helping himself began to blur. Emily noticed a change in John. She saw the way his eyes gleamed with a mix of excitement and something darker when he spoke of his plans. She confronted him one evening, their makeshift headquarters dimly lit by the glow of computer screens. John, what are we becoming? Emily asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. We started this to save the future, not to manipulate it for our own benefit. John looked at her, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. Emily, everything I've done has been to ensure our success. Sometimes we have to make hard choices to achieve our goals. But at what cost? She pressed. We're losing ourselves in this fight. We have to stay true to our principles, or we're no better than those we're trying to stop. John felt a pang of remorse, but his resolve remained firm. I understand your concerns, Emily. But we can't afford to be idealistic. The stakes are too high. John's manipulations did not go unnoticed. Within his circle of allies, whispers of dissent began to spread. Some questioned his motives, others feared the repercussions of his actions. The very power that had propelled him to prominence now threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. One night, as John was reviewing his latest plans, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Senator Thompson, his face grim and eyes filled with worry. John, we need to talk, Thompson said, closing the door behind him. There's a growing concern among our allies. They believe you're losing sight of our mission. John bristled at the implication. Senator, everything I've done has been for the mission. You know that. Thompson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I know, but perception matters. We can't afford to lose the trust of those who support us. You need to be more transparent, more accountable. John's anger flared, but he forced himself to remain calm. I'll do what I can, Senator. But remember, we're fighting for the future. We can't let fear or doubt slow us down. Thompson nodded, but the concern in his eyes remained. As he left, John couldn't shake the feeling that his grip on the movement was slipping. As tensions within their ranks grew, John and Emily found themselves facing a new threat. An anonymous group, calling themselves the Guardians, had begun to publicly challenge John's predictions and methods. They accused him of exploiting his knowledge for personal gain and warned that his actions could have unintended consequences. The Guardians' influence spread quickly, fueled by a sophisticated propaganda campaign. They painted John as a false prophet, a man who had lost his way and was leading humanity down a dangerous path. The public, already on edge from the revelations of the future, began to waver in their support. John and Emily worked tirelessly to counter the Guardians' claims, but the damage was done. The movement they had built was fracturing, and their allies were growing increasingly wary. John knew he needed to regain control, but the path forward was unclear. In a desperate bid to restore his credibility, John decided to take a bold step. He would reveal one of the most shocking secrets of the future, a catastrophic event that would shake the world to its core. It was a gamble, but he believed it was the only way to prove his legitimacy and rally his supporters. John stood before a crowd of thousands, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Cameras from every major news network were trained on him, broadcasting his message to millions around the world. Emily stood by his side, her presence a comforting reminder of the stakes. Thank you all for being here, John began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. I stand before you today with a heavy heart. The future I have seen is not just a possibility, it is a certainty unless we act now. He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. In 3 years' time, a series of natural disasters will strike our planet with unprecedented ferocity. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions will devastate entire regions. Millions will be displaced, and countless lives will be lost. This is not a warning, it's a reality that I have witnessed firsthand. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. John's eyes scanned the faces before him, searching for signs of belief, of hope. But we can change this, he continued, his voice rising with conviction. We have the knowledge and the power to prepare, to mitigate the damage, and to save lives. But we must act now. We must come together as a global community, setting aside our differences and working towards a common goal. As he spoke, John felt a surge of determination. This was his moment, his chance to prove himself and steer humanity towards a brighter future. He only hoped that the world was ready to listen. John Matthews' revelation had sent shockwaves through the world. His warning about the impending natural disasters resonated deeply, sparking a global movement to prepare for the worst. Governments, organizations, and individuals rallied together, pooling resources and knowledge in an unprecedented show of unity. For a brief moment, it seemed as if humanity might actually heed John's warning and avert the coming catastrophe. Yet, even as preparations were underway, John felt a growing unease. The Guardians, the mysterious group that had been challenging his credibility, had not been silenced. Instead, their attacks grew more sophisticated and widespread. They claimed that John was manipulating the truth for his own gain and that his predictions were designed to incite fear and chaos. Emily worked tirelessly to counter their propaganda, but the Guardians' influence was pervasive. Doubts began to creep into the minds of even John's most ardent supporters. The unity that had seemed so promising started to fracture, and John's control over the movement began to slip. As the pressure mounted, John found himself increasingly isolated. The allies he had once relied on were now questioning his motives, and the constant scrutiny was taking its toll. Desperation drove him to make decisions he would have once considered unthinkable. John's manipulations grew more overt and ruthless. He used his knowledge of future events to blackmail and coerce, ensuring compliance from those who doubted him. He justified his actions by telling himself that the end justified the means, that he was the only one who could save humanity from the coming disaster. Emily watched in horror as John descended further into darkness. She confronted him repeatedly, but her words fell on deaf ears. John was consumed by his own sense of destiny, convinced that he alone held the key to humanity's survival. One evening, as John was poring over maps and charts in their headquarters, Emily approached him with a look of grim determination. "John, this has to stop. You're becoming the very thing we set out to fight against." John looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Emily, you don't understand. The stakes are too high. We can't afford to play by the rules anymore." "No, John, you don't understand," Emily shot back, her voice trembling. "You're losing yourself. This isn't about saving the future anymore. It's about power and control. You're becoming a monster." Her words cut deep, but John couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the truth in them. Instead, he turned away, burying himself in his work and shutting out the only person who still believed in him. John's actions began to have serious consequences. The alliances he had carefully built started to crumble, and the movement he had inspired began to turn against him. Protests erupted, not just against the impending disasters, but against John himself. People demanded answers, transparency, and accountability, things John was no longer willing to provide. In a final attempt to regain control, John orchestrated a series of events designed to prove his predictions true and solidify his position. He manipulated markets, engineered political scandals, and even staged small-scale disasters, all to create the illusion of his infallibility. But this time, he had gone too far. The Guardians exposed his manipulations, revealing the extent of his deceit to the world. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving. John Matthews, once seen as a savior, was now branded a villain, a man who had betrayed humanity's trust for his own gain. John's downfall was swift and brutal. His remaining allies abandoned him, and he became a pariah, hunted by those he had wronged. The media, once eager to amplify his message, now tore him apart. His name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption. Emily, heartbroken and disillusioned, could no longer stand by his side. She left him, taking with her the remnants of their movement and the hope that they could still make a difference. Alone and on the run, John was left to face the consequences of his actions. In a last-ditch effort to salvage something from the wreckage of his life, John returned to the place where it all began, the time machine. He believed that if he could go back and change key moments, he could prevent his descent into darkness and set things right. But as he stood before the machine, preparing to activate it one last time, he realized the futility of his plan. The past could not be undone, and his actions had set events into motion that could not be reversed. In a moment of clarity, John understood that the true power of time was not in altering it, but in learning from it. With this realization, John made a final, fateful decision. He would use the machine to return to the future, to face the world he had tried so hard to change and to confront the consequences of his actions. It was a journey he might not survive, but it was the only way to atone for his sins and perhaps, in some small way, make amends. John Matthews had returned to the future, a place now more dystopian than he remembered. The world was teetering on the edge of collapse. The same cataclysms he had warned about were unfolding with terrifying precision. He found himself in the ruins of a once great city, its skyline shattered by earthquakes, its streets flooded by rising seas. The air was thick with smoke and despair. John's return did not go unnoticed. Word of his reappearance spread quickly, and it wasn't long before a group of survivors found him. Among them was a familiar face, Dr. Karen Blake, his old friend and one of the few people who had always harbored doubts about his sanity. "John, is it really you?" Karen's voice was filled with a mix of disbelief and relief. "It's me," John replied, his voice heavy with guilt and determination. "I came back to fix things, to make amends." Karen eyed him warily. "You have a lot to answer for. People believed in you, and you let them down. But if you're really here to help, then we need to talk." John knew this was his chance to rebuild trust and perhaps, with Karen's help, find a way to salvage the future. Karen led John to an underground bunker where a group of resistance fighters had gathered. These were the people who had survived the disasters, the ones who had lost everything but were still fighting for a better future. The bunker was a hive of activity, filled with makeshift labs, stockpiles of food and water, and a sense of grim determination. John was introduced to the leaders of the resistance: Sarah, a former military officer who had become the group's de facto commander; David, a brilliant engineer who specialized in salvaging and repurposing old technology; and Lena, a scientist dedicated to finding ways to reverse the environmental damage. "We've been working to survive, but it's not enough," Sarah explained, her voice firm but weary. "We need a plan, a way to fight back and rebuild." John shared his knowledge of the future, outlining the key events that had led to their current predicament. He explained how the disasters were not just natural but exacerbated by human negligence and greed. The resistance leaders listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and skepticism. "You have information we can use," David said, his eyes narrowing. "But we need to know if we can trust you. How do we know you're not just here to manipulate us again?" John took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know I've made mistakes, and I've paid the price. But I believe we can change things if we work together. Let me prove it to you." John and the resistance leaders spent days poring over maps, data, and John's recollections of future events. They formulated a plan to strike at the heart of the oppressive regime that controlled what was left of society. The goal was not just survival, but to reclaim and rebuild a world worth living in. Their first target was a series of automated factories that produced the surveillance drones and weapons used by the regime to maintain control. Disabling these factories would not only cripple the regime's power but also provide the resistance with much-needed resources. The mission was dangerous, but it was a risk they had to take. John volunteered to lead the operation, determined to show his commitment to the cause. The night of the raid was tense. John, Sarah, David, and a small team of fighters made their way through the devastated city, avoiding patrols and surveillance drones. The factories loomed ahead, their towering structures a stark reminder of the regime's might. Using his knowledge of the future, John guided the team through the factory's defenses. They disabled security systems, neutralized guards, and planted explosives at key points. The operation was nearly complete when an alarm sounded. They had been discovered. "Move, now!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The team split up, each member carrying out their final tasks with precision and speed. John and David worked together to plant the last of the explosives. As they set the timer, a group of heavily armed guards burst into the room. A firefight ensued, the air filled with the deafening sounds of gunfire and explosions. "Go! I'll cover you!" John yelled, his heart pounding. David hesitated for a moment, then nodded and ran towards the exit. John held his ground, firing at the guards and buying precious seconds for his team to escape. Just as the last of his bullets ran out, the explosives detonated. The factory was engulfed in a massive explosion, the shockwave knocking John off his feet. John awoke to the sound of rubble shifting and the distant wail of sirens. He was alive, but barely. His body ached with pain, and his vision was blurred. As he struggled to his feet, he saw Sarah and David approaching, their faces a mix of relief and concern. "You did it, John," Sarah said, helping him up. "The factories are down. We've dealt a major blow to the regime." John nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The raid was just the beginning. There were more battles to be fought, more sacrifices to be made. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they returned to the bunker, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Despite their victory, the future he had seen was still looming, a dark shadow over their efforts. He knew there was more to uncover, more secrets that held the key to their survival. And so, with the trust of the resistance slowly rebuilding and the knowledge of the future as their guide, John and his new allies prepared for the next phase of their fight. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and doubt, but they were ready to face it head-on. John Matthews had started this journey as a broken man, driven by guilt and a desire for redemption. Now, he was part of something greater, a movement that had the potential to change the course of history. And he would stop at nothing to see it through to the end. The raid on the factories was a significant victory for the resistance, but it came at a cost. The regime, now aware of the growing insurgency, tightened its grip on the remaining population. Martial law was declared, and surveillance increased tenfold. The resistance had won a battle, but the war was far from over. John Matthews and his team knew they needed to strike again, but this time, they had to be smarter and more strategic. The key to their success lay in dismantling the regime's central command structure. It was a risky plan, one that required precision, bravery, and an intimate knowledge of the enemy's operations. Emily, who had become an indispensable member of the resistance, took the lead in gathering intelligence. Using her skills as a journalist and investigator, she infiltrated high-security areas, posing as a loyalist. She gathered crucial information about the regime's headquarters, their leaders, and their vulnerabilities. One evening, Emily returned to the bunker with a grim look on her face. "I found out something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The regime is planning a massive offensive. They know we're growing stronger, and they're preparing to wipe us out once and for all." John felt a chill run down his spine. "When?" "Within the next 2 weeks," Emily replied. "We have to act fast." The resistance leaders convened an emergency meeting. They laid out a plan to infiltrate the regime's headquarters and disable their communications and command systems. It was a high-stakes operation, but it was their best chance to turn the tide of the war. The night of the operation was tense. John, Emily, Sarah, David, and a select team of resistance fighters made their way through the darkened city, avoiding patrols and checkpoints. The regime's headquarters was a heavily fortified building, surrounded by armed guards and surveillance drones. Using the intelligence Emily had gathered, they navigated through the defenses, planting explosives at strategic points and hacking into the building's security systems. The team moved with precision, each member knowing their role and the importance of their mission. As they reached the command center, they encountered heavier resistance. A fierce battle ensued, with bullets flying and explosions rocking the building. John and his team fought valiantly, pushing their way through the enemy forces. Finally, they reached the central command room. John and David began to disable the communication systems while Sarah and Emily provided cover. The room was filled with high-tech equipment, screens displaying real-time data, and the panicked voices of regime officers. "We're almost there," David shouted, working frantically to complete the task. "Just a few more seconds." But those few seconds felt like an eternity. As John worked, he noticed a figure moving in the shadows. Before he could react, the figure lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The two men struggled, their fight a brutal clash of strength and desperation. John managed to gain the upper hand, pinning his attacker to the ground. As he looked into the man's eyes, he realized it was someone he recognized, an old colleague from his past, now working for the regime. "Why, Alan?" John asked, breathless. "Why are you doing this?" Alan's face twisted with a mixture of anger and regret. "I had no choice, John. They control everything. But you have a chance to change it all." With those words, Alan slipped a small device into John's hand, a keycard that granted access to the regime's most secure systems. Before John could ask more, Alan succumbed to his injuries, his eyes closing in finality. With the keycard in hand, John and David completed their task, disabling the regime's communications and command systems. The building was rocked by explosions as the resistance fighters planted their final charges and made their escape. Outside, the city was in chaos. The regime's forces were in disarray, their leaders unable to communicate and coordinate their response. It was a moment of triumph for the resistance, but John knew it was only the beginning. As they regrouped at the bunker, John couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. He knew that the regime would retaliate with all its might. The next few days were crucial, and any misstep could spell disaster for the resistance. "What's our next move?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the tension. John looked at his team, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. "We need to use this chaos to our advantage. We have to hit them where it hurts the most, at their core." The keycard Alan had given him provided access to the regime's central database, a treasure trove of information that could expose their deepest secrets and weaknesses. It was their best chance to dismantle the regime once and for all. But accessing the database was no easy feat. It required infiltrating the regime's most secure facility, a task even more dangerous than their previous missions. John knew the risks, but he also knew that they had no other choice. The resistance prepared for the final assault with a sense of grim determination. Every member knew that this mission could be their last, but they were willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to overthrow the regime. John led the team through the devastated city, their resolve unshaken by the dangers that lay ahead. They reached the secure facility under the cover of darkness, using the keycard to bypass the initial security layers. Inside, they moved swiftly, disabling guards and hacking into the facility's systems. The deeper they went, the more fortified the defenses became. The tension was palpable, every step fraught with the risk of discovery. Finally, they reached the central server room. John and David worked together to access the database, their fingers flying over the controls. The room was filled with the hum of machinery and the glow of monitors displaying streams of data. "We're in," David said, his voice filled with relief. "Now we just need to download the files." As the data transfer began, alarms blared throughout the facility. The regime's forces were converging on their location, and time was running out. "Hold them off!" John shouted, as Sarah and the others took up defensive positions. The room erupted in gunfire, the resistance fighters holding their ground against overwhelming odds. The data transfer was agonizingly slow. Each second felt like an eternity as John watched the progress bar inch forward. He knew that their survival depended on completing the download before the regime's forces overwhelmed them. Finally, the transfer was complete. John grabbed the storage device and turned to his team. "Let's move!" They fought their way out of the facility, the corridors filled with the sounds of battle. As they reached the exit, an explosion rocked the building, sending debris raining down around them. Outside, the city was a war zone. The regime's forces were in full retreat, their command structure shattered. The resistance had dealt a crippling blow, but the cost was high. Many of their fighters had fallen, and those who remained were battered and exhausted. Back at the bunker, John and his team reviewed the data they had obtained. It contained detailed information about the regime's operations, their secrets, and their plans for the future. It was the key to dismantling their power and rebuilding society. But as they celebrated their victory, John couldn't shake the feeling of loss. The cost of their fight had been immense, and the path ahead was still uncertain. He knew that their work was far from over, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. John stood before the remaining members of the resistance, his voice filled with determination. "We've taken a crucial step, but our journey is not yet complete. We must use this information to build a better future, one where freedom and justice prevail. Together, we can create a world worth fighting for." The resistance fighters cheered, their spirits lifted by John's words. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face it, united in their resolve. As John looked at the faces of his comrades, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come a long way from the broken man who had stumbled out of the psychiatric hospital. Now, he was part of something greater, a movement that had the potential to change the course of history. And he would stop at nothing to see it through to the end. The resistance had struck a decisive blow against the regime, but the fight was not yet over. Armed with the information they had retrieved from the regime's central database, John and his allies prepared for one final, all-out assault. The goal was to dismantle the regime's remaining power structures and liberate the city once and for all. John stood before the assembled fighters, his voice filled with determination. "This is it. Our final push. We have the knowledge, we have the power, and most importantly, we have each other. Let's end this." The resistance fighters cheered, their spirits bolstered by John's words. They knew the risks, but they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The resistance fighters clashed with the regime's forces in the streets, buildings, and underground tunnels of the city. Explosions rocked the cityscape, and the sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air. John led the charge, using his knowledge of future events to outmaneuver and outsmart the enemy at every turn. Emily, Sarah, David, and the other leaders fought alongside him, their resolve unwavering. They knew that this was their last chance to overthrow the regime and reclaim their future. Despite their bravery and skill, the resistance faced overwhelming odds. The regime's forces were well-equipped and ruthless, and the fighting was brutal. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the cost of the battle became painfully clear. As the battle reached its climax, John found himself in the heart of the regime's stronghold. He and his team had fought their way through the defenses, but they were now surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of options. The only way to ensure victory was to destroy the regime's central command hub, but doing so would require a tremendous sacrifice. "John, we can't hold them off much longer," Sarah shouted, her voice strained with exhaustion. John looked around at his friends, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. "There's only one way," he said quietly. "I'll stay behind and set off the explosives. You all need to get out of here." "No, John," Emily protested, her eyes filled with tears. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," John replied, his voice firm but gentle. "This is the only way to end this once and for all. You need to go. Now." Reluctantly, Emily, Sarah, and David nodded, knowing that John was right. They hurried to the exit, leaving John behind. As he set the charges, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that his sacrifice would give humanity a fighting chance at a better future. With the explosives in place, John activated the timer and took a deep breath. He thought of all the people he had met, the lives he had touched, and the future he had seen. As the timer counted down, John closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer for the world he was leaving behind. The explosion was cataclysmic, tearing through the regime's stronghold and collapsing the building in on itself. The shockwave echoed through the city, and the battle fell silent as both sides realized what had happened. The regime's command structure was destroyed, and their forces, leaderless and disoriented, began to retreat. The resistance had won, but the cost was immense. John Matthews, the man who had seen the future and fought to change it, was gone. His sacrifice had ensured their victory, but it also left a void that could never be filled. In the days and weeks that followed, the resistance worked tirelessly to rebuild. They organized efforts to provide food, water, and medical care to the survivors. They established a new government, one built on the principles of justice and equality that John had fought for. Emily, Sarah, and David became leaders in the new society, carrying on John's legacy and ensuring that his vision for a better future was realized. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to honor John's memory by creating a world worthy of his sacrifice. Years passed, and the city slowly began to heal. The scars of the past remained, but the people had forged a new path forward. The environment, once on the brink of collapse, showed signs of recovery thanks to the efforts of scientists and activists inspired by John's warnings. On the anniversary of the final battle, a statue was erected in the center of the city. It depicted John Matthews, standing tall and resolute, a symbol of hope and resilience. People gathered to pay their respects, remembering the man who had given everything to secure their future. As the sun set on the city, Emily stood before the statue, her heart filled with a mix of sorrow and pride. She placed a hand on the cold stone, whispering a silent promise to continue the fight for a better world. John Matthews' journey had been one of redemption and sacrifice. He had seen the darkness of the future and fought to change it, ultimately giving his life for the cause. His story was a testament to the power of hope, determination, and the enduring human spirit. And though he was gone, his legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had known him, and in the brighter, better world they were building in his memory.